Well, hello, thinkers, and welcome to a very special broadcast that we have today on the census and the birth of Christ. And we are very excited to have Dr. Fred Baltz with us again. And Dr. Fred has been such a blessing to me. He has helped me in many cases with props, and he created a chariot and Pharaoh's crown. And then just recently, he helped us with our crowns for the Israel dilemma. And so, Fred, welcome to this thinker.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Dr. Fred, when I look at the scripture, it tells us in Luke, the 2nd chapter, it says, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. And Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem." So this podcast is really going to be investigating this event. And I'm so glad that you've taken the time to look into it. Fred, why is the census and the birth of Christ significant to knowing that these events happened?
Part of the answer is Luke, in his thinking, writes in such a way to show that what Jesus did belongs on the world stage. So there are places in his gospel where he names the people who were the rulers at the time. He's giving us a sense of history because Jesus belongs in history. The naming of Quirinius helps us determine exactly when in history. This man was well known, and in 6 AD, he came into Judea, and that event, it almost brought a war. So people remembered him, and Luke therefore refers to him. Although what we're looking at in the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of Luke, the birth of Jesus, is from a time before that. The real key to all this is finding the proper time window in which we should look. Then things start to become clear.
And so you mentioned that you think that Luke names him because he's basically tying the birth of Christ to world leaders of the time, correct?
That's right. And here's where critical scholars and other historians have pointed the finger at Luke and said he's wrong. They said he's mistaken, because this major event that I alluded to earlier, which almost led to war, it happened in 6 AD, and Josephus writes about it. He says that this man of great respect, great dignity, Quirinius, and in the King James Version it's Quirinius. Quirinius came into Syria and into Judea, and the reason he came, he was sent to liquidate the estate of the surviving tetrarch of King Herod, and also then to take account of the people. This marked the end of any kind of local rule, even if it was just puppet rule. Now the land and the people would come under direct Roman authority. That's why there was almost a war, but the high priest managed to keep the lid on things and keep everybody's tempers tamped down. So that's an event that's, kind of like our December 7th or our September 11th. It was in the people's minds. So the critical scholars have said, well, Luke is wrong because that happened in 6 AD. And Herod was dead by then. He'd been dead for years by then. And yet Luke says that Herod was king when Jesus was born. Matthew says the same thing. So there's been this supposed discrepancy. But as we know from looking at the Exodus and investigating all the issues there, you have to first find the right time window in which to look. And if you find the right time window in which to look and then start to investigate, a lot of times what seems to be problems become resolved. In the 2nd century, a Christian by the name of Justin Martyr said that Quirinius was Rome's first procurator in Judea. Now, a procurator is not a governor. Luke seems to say that this counting, this census, this registration happened when Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's how a lot of people have translated it, but it doesn't necessarily say he was the technical governor. The word that Luke uses in the Greek is a participle which you can only press to say he was governing. Quirinius was governing in Syria when this count took place, but you can govern as a procurator and not just as a governor. So we're starting to find a different time in which Quirinius was there governing, but before that infamous 6 AD mission that almost led to war. Do we find some kind of account of the people if we go back earlier? Yes, we do. It wasn't just a Roman census, which was a count of only the Roman citizens and did not require them to travel. It was a counting of all the people in all the Roman provinces. In the year 2 BC, in Rome, there was a huge celebration, and you can imagine that people were getting ready for that for months or even years to come. It was the 750th anniversary of the founding of the city, and it was also the 25th anniversary of Augustus Caesar as emperor. What do you do when you have a huge celebration like that? Well, kind of like our bicentennial for those of us who are old enough to remember that. They gave the emperor a title, Father of the Country, and it is highly, highly likely that a collection of loyalty oaths from across the empire was part of the basis for that title, Father of the Country. We have evidence. We have inscriptional evidence. We have written evidence in the works of historians that there was a worldwide registration for the purpose of collecting loyalty oaths from people. And that belongs right in the time before that huge 2 BC celebration. It was actually in February of 2 BC. This collection of loyalty oaths looks like the real reason that Joseph came to Bethlehem. That's the counting, that's the census. Not the full Roman census, but a different kind of census. That dates it to about 3 BC, which is when all of the early Christian witnesses claim that Jesus was born. Incidentally, Josephus says that at this time there were 6,000 Pharisees who refused to take a loyalty oath to Herod and to Caesar. He is no doubt talking about this same loyalty oath as it happened in Judea. The critical scholars would all say that Jesus was born in 5 or 6 or even 7 BC, because they all believe that Herod the Great died in 4 BC, so Jesus had to be born before that in their thinking. Jesus wasn't born right at that mark between the millennia. There's a little bit of, I don't even call it error, but there's a little bit of drift there. But it does appear that Jesus was born at the very end of the year 3 BC, maybe into 2 BC.
Were Roman censuses unique?
One of the things that Augustus was proud of and placed on his official list of great accomplishments called the Res Gestae was the establishment of the censuses on a fairly regular basis, probably about 14 years apart. But there is no census, no Roman census that falls in this general time when Jesus was born. So that's another thing that the critical scholars have pointed to and said that you can't believe this Gospel of Luke. This is just wrong. However, it doesn't say in Luke's text that it was a Roman census. It doesn't say anything about taxing either. That's apparently an assumption that the translators of the King James made. What it says is, in Luke's Greek, apographe, the verb for bringing in a registration. It's a registration that happened which brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. So that's a broader concept than a strictly Roman census.
The reason why some people have had a problem with the beginning of the birth of Christ has to do with the timing of this taxation and the timing of Herod's death. Yes.
The majority has believed and still does believe that Herod died in 4 BC. That's because the majority needs to look at it closer. And there's better reason, and I would say now proof, that Herod died in 1 BC. Here's one of the reasons why the claim is made that he died in 4. Josephus tells us a lot about the last days of Herod. And he says that shortly before Herod died, there was an eclipse of the moon. He gives a story, he says much more. But there was an eclipse of the moon, and Herod died shortly after that. You have one on March 12th of 4 BC. It wasn't much of an eclipse. It was just a partial eclipse. You have another one in 1 BC. That was a full eclipse, and it lasted a long time. That's just one of the reasons to redate Herod's death. Varus, the governor, it used to be objected that Varus was there from 6 to 4 BC, and we read in Josephus that just before Herod died, he talked to Varus. So that proves that Herod died back in 4 BC. If you put together the list of the governors of Syria, you find that you are not able to do that with complete precision. So different scholars have offered us lists, and they fully recognize and admit that there is some unknown there, and there's also some possibility that a particular ruler ruled a little longer or a little shorter than what's on the list. There's a gap in the list of the governors of Syria, right there before 1 BC, and some would say, I am among them, that most likely Varus came back there again and was governor in the year 2, for some time following that. We have Varus filling the gap so that he could speak with Herod then just before Herod died. It all again comes together and makes perfect sense. That removes, again, the problem of Herod's death being thought of as in 4 BC. I'll just mention that there's a stone in the Vatican Museum that's called the Quirinius sepulchral stone. It doesn't have anyone's name on it because the name has been broken off. But the stone looks like this. And I know it's going to be hard for you to see the letters on it, but the very interesting thing about this is that it talks about someone who was governor of Syria twice. Well, the people who have looked to Quirinius and have known he governed in 6 AD as governor, that famous or infamous event that almost led to war, have said, well, look, he governed, this is about Quirinius, he governed again earlier, so we don't have a problem with the Bible after all. However, I want to tell you about where this stone was found. This stone was found outside of a villa in Italy, in the city of Tivoli, It was found outside the villa belonging to the Varus family. So this stone, I think, and others too, is really about Varus. But as we said earlier, if he was the one who was governor twice and was there just before 1 BC, well, this again, it all comes out. It all makes sense. It's a flawless, seamless bringing together of all of the truth claims in the gospel together with the truth claims of history. And we have a picture of what happened and how it happened and when it happened like we never had before.
The character of Varus and Herod both being together, the reason that's important is because they were saying that Herod was from a different time period.
The real proof, and I'll just go into this briefly here, the real proof that I alluded to earlier that Herod died in 1 and not in 4 has to do with an apple and with a test that I did right here in my wood shop. And I can tell you that based on other things I've read, this test will stand. 5 days before he died, according to Josephus, Herod asked for an apple and a knife. He meant to use the knife to kill himself. He was in such physical misery at the time. Well, in March, following the eclipse, if Herod asked for an apple, he would have gotten a little pile of brown goo, because that's what happens to an apple when you don't have the modern means to preserve it. If it were 1 BC, after that eclipse in January, there would still be apples available from the harvest. And I've got the pictures to demonstrate that. So that means the window in which we look for Jesus' birth has shifted to later into this 2 and 3 range, with Herod dying in 1. And that is the very same time in which we find the worldwide registration. And that is also the very same time when we find things going on in the sky that are tremendously fascinating. And I believe we have also found the Star of Bethlehem.
If Herod asked for an apple, why would that be different, between the different times?
We are used to having fruit there all year round. We go into the supermarket and it doesn't matter what month it is, there are the apples in the fruit section. Before the 20th century, that could not happen because there was no way to preserve fruit that long. Even if you cooled it, even if you had some cave, that's what I tried to reproduce here in my shop. I have an area of the shop that is just kind of barely heated, and I thought, this simulates a cave. Suppose people tried to preserve fruit in a cave. But I've read since, it wouldn't matter if you had a cave, if you had a refrigerator, there's no way you can preserve an apple into March. March is the month in 4 BC when this would have to have happened because it follows the eclipse in March. In January was the month in 1 BC following that eclipse. So Herod could have the apple in 1 BC, but in 4 BC, at that time of year determined by the eclipse, nothing but a pile of brown goo.
Because the apple wouldn't have lasted that long in the season. And so what you're saying is that Christ was born closer to that time period.
Correct. And all the claims that Luke makes check out. This isn't some fanciful reconstruction of events. This is what happened. And that coercive government act was what ended up fulfilling the prophecy that brought Joseph to Bethlehem so that the one who was to come would be born there.
So what you're suggesting then is that this registration is lining up with the particular time of the birth of Christ, and the criticisms against the gospel and the gospel of Luke actually are invalid.
They are invalid. They cannot be maintained.
What does that have to do with the Star of Bethlehem then?